Hey everybody, Red Mage here, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be doing a little bit more work on my Dolmenwood campaign. I've already talked a little bit about this before. I did a video on my conversion of the Dolmenwood Monster Manual into Shadowdark. It looks like things are picking up in terms of running a Dolmenwood campaign for me. I'm actually probably going to be running 2 different groups in the same campaign world, which is really exciting for me. I haven't actually done that in a long time. I've done West Marches, but that's not quite the same thing as running 2 distinct groups in the same world. So we'll see how that all works out. But one of the things I'm going to need to do if I'm running 2 groups is keep a pretty good calendar. And I wanted to show you guys the work I've been doing on the Dolmenwood calendar because I think I'm pretty happy with it. And I think if you're going to be running a Dolmenwood group, you can steal what I've done and use it for yourself. Because, well, I'll show you in a minute. But basically, here's the Dolmenwood calendar book. This is a free PDF that you can download from dolmenwood.com, Necrotic Gnome Press. You can get it on ttrpg. This is the version from last year, so it might have been updated since then. I'm not sure actually about that. But if you've seen this document, it's great. It shows you the whole calendar for Dolmenwood, and you have the names of the months, and you have the feast days of the year, the saints' feast days for the Florentine Church. You have, the different unseasons that can begin and when they can begin, along with the phases of the moon. So it's a really cool little PDF. It is a little tricky because you have to modify it. You can print it out, modify it by hand. Your players are not going to have the same one you're going to have. And so I wanted to get an online accessible calendar where the players can see what I'm doing. Basically, they can see the calendar for themselves. They can go there for themselves. They can see the feast days that are coming up. They can see the phases of the moon, for example. So I accessed a really, really cool website, which I'm sure you guys, maybe some of you have seen before. This is appfantasycalendar.com. It's just fantasycalendar.com. I'll put a link below to where you guys can get to it. It has a free version and a paid version. I'm just using the free version. The paid version has some interesting features with weather and active time. You can program it so that it progresses day by day, and it gives you like weather and just lots of different things for the day. Anyway, what you guys see here is that it has a bunch of cool features. So let me show you what the features it has here. I'm going into the edit for a minute here. Okay, so you have so this is the Dolmenwood calendar, and as a brief overview, you guys can see here's the year, and you can shift the years back and forth, and it'll all work for the years, which I think is really, really cool. You have the name of the feast days, as you can see here. Because I have access to the owner view, I have the unseasons, which if you go to the guest view, the players won't have. So you can see when the unseasons can come up and come down, and they're not going to see that. They're not going to see the chances. You can put your own notes there. And that's what I'm doing. So I have, if you click on the end of hitching, for example, it says if begun, end of hitching if begun. See the 30th of Braghold, which is the very end. I'll go to that in a minute. But then I have things like the winter solstice. You'll also see that I have this called Ascent and Hangel's Eve, which is, I've created a whole bunch of extra feast days for the Florentine Church in my world, because one of the things I really like about it is that it has all of these saints' feast days, which is great, but there's no like celebrations of for example, the 5 prophets in the feast days of the year, and you'd think they would, right? That there would be some sort of celebration of those prophets, sort of akin to maybe something like Easter or Christmas, right? In the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, nothing there. So I decided to add those in, a few different feast days. So I added 1 feast day for each of the 5 prophets, and then I added the Ascent feast, which is sort of like an extended period from the winter solstice to the end of Grimvold, which is sort of like Advent leading into Christmas. And I wanted to add a bunch of stuff in. So anyway, I thought that would be kind of cool. You guys can use that if you'd like. So again, I'll put links below to both this app and to my particular calendar, so you guys can use it. Now, you'll only have access to the guest view. You won't be able to like copy and paste, but hopefully seeing the guest view, you guys can, if you want to just adapt it, you can just copy what I have over to yours. Now, you'll see how it functions. Basically, you just create the regular schedule. You go to, for example, your weekdays, and you name each of the weekdays something different. So in this one, you can put as many weekdays as you want. It's actually a really cool app for a lot of different I mean, it's very flexible. You can have, 1-day weeks all the way up to, 20-day weeks if you want. you can completely customize that. So I just put in the Dolmenwood names here, and then I did the same thing with the month, and you can do the number of days in the month. And I did 28 days, and then if you know Dolmenwood, right, they have these extra, what they call Wizen days, right? They're kind of, or Wizen days. I'm not sure how you would say that, but it's the end of at the end of the month. There sometimes are extra days that are added in, and they have their own special names. So I did that. I put in special names. Here's Hanglemas and Dryble's Day. Down here you have the Day of Virgins and Jarl's Day. You have Hop Fast, Smithing, Shortening, Longshanks Day. I added the special events on those days. So it's in the right column of Kali and Chime, but it's its own day, basically. And then, so you can add in that, which I thought was pretty cool. And then you can do leap days. That's how I added those in. You just add leap days, and then you say where they go. You add a month at the end of there. So I added all the leap days in. And then I added the moon, and I just called it the moon. I'm not sure what it's called in Dolmenwood. And it says specifically that the phase of the moon is 29.3 days, or 29 and a third day. So I did 29.33333, and I set it there so that it actually pretty much works out to the Dolmenwood calendar. If you look, you'll see there's a new moon on the 4th and a full moon on the 19th. And if you go to the Dolmenwood calendar on the first day, you'll see it's a new moon on the 4th and a full moon on the 19th. And then if you look at the next month, it'll be a new moon on the 4th and a full moon on the 18th. And it's basically that. Here you'll see it's actually a new moon on the 3rd and a full moon on the 18th. So it's not quite exactly right, but it goes back to being right most of the time, and it'll get off again slightly by just like a very slight difference, and then it'll be back. So anyway, I think it's pretty cool, the app as a whole. Again, I didn't develop the app. It's not something, I'm not paying for it. They didn't contact me to say, hey, push my app or anything like that. I just think it's cool. I really, really like it. So anyway, you can also add stuff with seasons. I didn't use I just added in events. Like I added the winter solstice, and then I added the equinoxes, and then summer solstice. But you can build it based on the seasons, and then you can add in based on the middle of your seasons when the solstice and the equinox events are. And if you do that, then you can also use weather, and then it'll pop up what the weather is that day, whether it's cloudy, rainy, and it'll change the temperature based on the year, and you can say what kind of region it is, and that way, it'll know not to get too hot or too cold, but it'll have some variance there. You can add in, if you pay for the whole thing, you can do locations, and you can do cycles, and then there's different event categories. It's actually pretty complex, but the basic is really easy. You can also do, if you pay for it, subscribe, you can get the real-time advancement. You can add in a clock, and then of course you can change the current date and move things along, which is great. So basically the players, if they go into guest view, will have this little green mark will tell what the current date is for them. Right, and so I can have the current date be moving forward. Maybe I have two groups and they have the same date. Maybe they're in different places, or maybe I use this for one group and I copy it and give another link to another group, and then they can use that, and it's just kind of like parallel timelines or whatever. I haven't figured out yet what I want to do. I'll probably just have everybody have access to the same calendar, and then I'll use that as a point of reference. But if you have one group, then it's really simple, because then you can just change the date on here as you go, right? Especially if you're playing online, or if you have an iPad or something like that, then you can just click the button and suddenly it's the next day, right? And then you don't have to worry about. You just say, okay, it's day 2, it's day 3, it's day 4, and you can use this, and you can even do the time of day down here. It's however long you want it to be, the current hour of the day. You can keep track of it very easily on here, especially for a hex crawl, especially for sort of an overworld campaign where you're going to be, the players are going to be taking several days out in the wilderness. Something like this is really useful. And again, you can do it by hand. You can do it with that great the great PDF that they've given you. I think this is super, super cool. But if you want a digital version, if you want something to be able to very easily edit and change and create events and add them in, and it's really, really easy to use. Once you've kind of used it once or twice, you can mess around with it. You'll learn how to change a lot of the events and hide events and change the color of events and add conditions to when events are going. So you can do things like if the year is exactly whatever the year is, and the date is, the month is exactly something, 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 and you'd say the day in the month is later than the 14th, but the day in the month is, what would you say, is not the 22nd, right? Then something is true, and it'll have a bunch of events that created that day. So you can create a bunch of conditions and then have those populate your map. So you can have really cool, weird astronomical events. You can have really cool, world-changing events. You can say if there's ever, a combination of the moon and and that's another thing too. You can do. You can add a whole bunch of extra. Sometimes I have to admit, sometimes especially when you add a whole bunch of conditions, it can be a little laggy. But you can add a whole bunch of extra moons, and they don't have to be moons. They can be planets, they can be things in the night sky, and so you can add them in if you want. Test moon, and you say this cycle is, say, 15 days. You add it in, and boom, there's a second moon. And so now you can have multiple moons in the night sky, multiple planets that appear and disappear in the night sky, and you can shift them, you can change their cycles around. I think that's really cool, and you can just delete it if you want. Boom, it's very easy, and it's deleted. So anyway, that's the app. I highly recommend you guys use it for almost any campaign, but especially for a campaign where you're going to be doing lots of hex crawling, where you want to incorporate this sense of like feast days and things like Dolmenwood, basically. So then in addition to that, what I did with particular Dolmenwood is that I went through and I added a little description of the saint from the book. So I found their epithet, so like Saint Vinicus, the thrice hanged, and I found in the book where it talks about what he's the patron of, which is mice, beggars, and churchwardens. And then I went through the book and I found where he's described, or where his statue or his image is described in a statue or in like a painting or in like a stained glass window. And I wrote it down here. So sometimes depicted smiling benevolently with 3 separate nooses hanging about his neck. That's Saint Vinicus. And now not every saint in the book has a description. Not every saint has patrons or like domains. They're not patron saints of anything particularly, like Saint Albert. He's Saint Albert of the Bleeding Palm, but he doesn't have a description anywhere, and he doesn't have a patronage. So the same with Saint Offred, who's the oath bearer, and things like that. Saint Chode, the mellifluous. Saint Clyde, the right-minded. So for many of them, all I did was just add in what I could find. Saint Elsa, for example, has patronages, as she's one of the major saints in the setting. But I couldn't find any description of her statues or anything like that. So, in other words, you can go through, if you want to use my calendar, you can just take it, and you have not only the feast, but also their epithet, and also if there's something particular about them that, a particular way that they're often shown. And that way, when it becomes that saint's feast day, and you're playing with the players, and they happen to be in a settlement, and you know, oh, it's the Feast of St. Gondov. I think that's how you say that name. Gondov? I actually don't know. The Converter of Kings, he's depicted clad in mail, holding aloft a candle, and carrying an unfurled scroll. And he's the patron of scribes, tourneys, and knights. Well, if it's that feast day and you're walking around the city, maybe there's a tournament in honor of Saint Gondov, right? Or if you go down and you have Saint Egort, who is the troglodyte. He's the patron of chandlers and undertakers. He's depicted in a hooded robe, head bowed, holding a candle aloft. There's 2 holding a candle aloft, right back to back. But anyway, then maybe this is the feast day of all the chandlers in the town, and maybe they have a sale on candles, or maybe it's a day when everyone's supposed to buy candles and burn them, right? You can come up with your own celebrations, your own feast day celebrations. I'm going to do that myself. I'm going to try to come through and write a little note about how people celebrate that saint when it comes up. Not that everybody's going to celebrate every feast day, but just if the players happen to be in town when one of these happens, then I can do that. And I'm going to use this calendar to help me, because I'm going to have it open when I play. And that means when the players go into a town and it happens to be a certain saint's feast day, then I know what it is. If they go to a particular shrine, well, then that's going to be detailed in the book anyway, and I'm not going to need to worry about it. But if they go into, Drigbolton, for example, anywhere, High Hankel, and it's the Feast of St. Panard, right? Now, all I know is that it's St. Panard the Lithe. Okay, well, I'm going to have to come up with something for that. But if I do, once I do, and granted it's a minor saint, but someone might mention, you know, you're looking pretty, you're looking like St. Panard over there, right? And then there's some that are more applicable, right? St. Lilibeth of the Sugared Breath. You can probably imagine a helplessly in love, kind of lad writing a love poem to his beloved, saying something about the breath of Saint Lilibeth, or your breaths, your voice, it's as sweet as the breath of Saint Lilibeth. You could start to work that stuff into your world, and using this as a baseline, using this as sort of the background for yourself allows you to start building that up. Now, you're not going to start with that, right? You're not going to start having a knowledge of all the saints and all these little throwing them in. But as you start writing about them and as you start making a little bit more about them and you know about them, then when it's their feast day or when a particular character maybe is named after them, right? Maybe they run into an NPC named Visig, and so they know Saint Visig, who is Saint Visig of the Canker. Well, that tells you something about their parents because they named this child after the saint of the Canker. Well, maybe you need to know something about them. Maybe you can incorporate that into their character. So I don't know. I think that's a really cool idea, and using this calendar as sort of the way of getting into that whole side of the world building is a really cool idea because, especially in the Middle Ages, people were so aware of the passage of time, right? I mean, the seasons and the feast days, the flow to the year was so much more real and visceral than it is to us today, right? Because of air conditioning and because we don't pay attention to feast days and because, we have a few things, we have a few holidays that kind of break up the year, but the year is basically monotonous. You don't need to pay attention to the seasons. You don't need to feel the seasons. You can stay indoors in an air-conditioned room and you don't feel the hot and the cold of the weather. You go outside and smell the flowers blooming or see the decay of the fall. Like, you don't have to do those things. And so we really kind of have alienated ourselves from that. But the Middle Ages, and Dolmenwood is very much a Middle Age fantasy setting, was just so infused with it, which is one of the things that drew me to the Dolmenwood books in the first place, right? This idea of the lived-in real world of the saints and the seasons and all of that, folk tales and folklore and folk traditions. So I wanted to kind of double down on that. So anyway, so you can find all that here. I'll put links to where you can get it again to my particular map. Now, also, as I said, there is this ascent, which is essentially this idea of it's kind of like Advent. So it starts on the winter solstice, and it goes all the way through to Hangel's Eve, which is sunning the 28th of Grimwald. And then on Hangel's Eve, there's a sort of celebration, a day of prayer and reflection, ending in a nighttime service at the local church. And then you have the Feast of the Ascent, which is on the 29th of Grimwald. It's a day of feasting and celebration involving the giving of gifts, works of charity, and much singing. And then the day after the Feast of the Ascent is the Feast of the Watchwell, or just it's called Watchwell. It's also on Dryble's Day, and it's the day after the Feast of the Ascent is known as Watchwell, a reference to the last admonition given to the followers of the 5 prophets before they ascended. Leftovers from the feasting of the previous day are distributed to the poor and those who were too far away or ill to attend the feast day. Right, so like Boxing Day, basically. And so that's the idea here. And you could always mix this in too, right? The Feast of St. Joan happens to be on the Feast of the Ascent. That's an interesting thing. All I know about St. Joan is that she's St. Joan the Broken. She's not mentioned really in the book as far as I can tell. So why does she get that feast day? That's kind of an interesting one, at least in my world. That's an interesting combination there. St. Cantius is the God Fool. St. Cantius, God Fool. And he gets a feast day during the Ascent. So that's interesting. Why did he do that? And then St. Baldric of the Liminal Eye. Why does he get one during the Ascent? And St. Elsa, she's the bomb gusher. She gets to be on the winter solstice and the beginning of Ascent. That's a huge day. So suddenly St. Elsa is much more important than she otherwise might have been. And then as I went through, I added Ogremas, which is celebrating the life of the prophet Ogremund, who is one of the 5 prophets. And basically the way I did it was because I have Grimwald at the very end of, because I have Ascent at the very end of Grimwald, from the 19th through to the 30th, I basically staggered every 2 months the other 5 prophets, so that there is basically 6 celebrations for the prophets one every 2 months. And that gives you, There's one for each of the 5, and then there's one celebrating them all, and that's the big one. But then you have you have Ogremas here on the 19th. And by the way, there's also the ones that are built into Dolmenwood, like the Feast of Cats. And so you have those sort of folk tale celebrations, folk celebrations too, that are different than the churches, right? And it makes sense that they would not necessarily overlap. That they're sort of folk tale celebrations that come from folk traditions, and maybe the church has sort of influenced them. But the peasants are like, hey, another day to celebrate, great, I'll take it, right? But they might not have the same actual starting points. So I had the Feast of Cats there, and then if you jump in here, I have Hogrishtide, which is a day of celebration and prayer dedicated to the life of the prophet Hogrish. And then you have, down here, you have Eladine's Day, a day of celebration and prayer dedicated to the prophet Eladine. That's right after the summer solstice, like the day after the summer solstice. And then you have down here Lacrimide, which is a day commemorating the prophet Lacrimide, traditionally of prayer and penance. I wanted to mix it up a little bit. I think I might actually expand this, so Lacrimide might be more of a, from, say, the Feast of St. Faxus all the way through to Lacrimide might be a period of, some, penance and silence or something like that. And then you get, in here you have the Feast of St. Cluid and the Festival of the Green Man, which are both big days. And then, of course, you have also Shub's Eve, which is, I sort of think of this as like Halloween. It's the right time of year for it. You get the Feast of St. Cygnus, who is the god, or who is the saint of the dead. And then you have Shub's Eve, which is, so I think I'm going to add in some more descriptions of these celebrations. That's one thing that I wish the book gave a little bit more indication of, right, is this sort of the feasting, the celebrations of these special days, like Shub's Eve and Druden Day, things like that, and the Festival of the Green Man, which there is a description of how that's celebrated here in the book. And then I have Theses Day, which is the very last, the day of celebration and feasting dedicated to the prophet Thesi, or Thesa, or Thes. I don't know how to say that, but I'm saying Thesi. And then that takes you to the hunting of the winter hart and the end of the year, the Dolmen Day and the Day of Doors. So, one of the things that's striking about the Middle Ages for me is how many feast days they had, right? Over half the year was dedicated to feasting. That's so cool, right? We think of the life of the peasant as a very hard life, and of course it was. You're out in the field working really, really hard, but at least in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, yeah, there were lots of dangers and perils, and life was hard, but also you had a huge uplift from the church and from the feast days of the church. And so I wanted to try to capture that too and add more than just what we get. Now we get 100 feast days, I think 100 feast days of the saints. And so you already have 100 out of the 352 days in Dolmenwood. So almost a third of them, or a little less than a third of them, are taken up with feasting. I wanted to add more. So anyway, that's basically all this video is, guys. It's just me kind of showing this off and recommending, first of all, that you use this app. I think it's really cool and helpful. But also that if you want, you can take my Dolmenwood, I keep saying map. I don't mean map, I mean calendar. You should use this calendar app. And if you want to use my particular calendar of Dolmenwood, feel free to take it. Again, all this stuff, except for some of the descriptions of the saints, comes from the free book, and like the actual calendar itself is I'm just translating it from the free PDF. So you can make this yourself. Anybody can make this themselves, pretty much. Again, there's some descriptions that I added based on what I read in the campaign guide. So that's from those books, but the rest of it is either stuff I made up or just from that free PDF. So again, it's not like it's crazy, right? It's not something I've worked a long, long time on, but I think it's kind of cool. And I don't know, I think you guys should, especially if you're going to run a Dolmenwood game, you might want to use this. Yeah. Well, anyway, that's basically it. Hope this has been interesting, everybody, and I'll see you all in another video.